Heading to Denmark now.
Hours later.
My first view of Sealand. Here we are on Sealand. Hi and welcome to Viking Superpowers. Well, I'm finally back from my Viking Superpowers Research Tour in Scandinavia, and this is the first of a series of many videos explaining and exploring the things I discovered over there. And the first thing we're going to look at is flying. Now, all of us modern people are used to flying. Most of us have flown at least once in our life. Some of us, like me, have flown quite a bit. And we've flown in all sorts of different aircraft, and we take it all for granted, really. But in the old days, going back only 200 years, nobody had ever flown, and flying was always the realm of the birds and the gods. So as I explore the Viking myths and the stories that go way back right into the Bronze Age, I'm looking at those flying stories, and I'm thinking, are these stories just myths, just fantasies? Just religious apparitions, or are these real beings flying in real craft? The first craft I'm going to talk about, the first flying man, is the story of Völund the Smith, who in Norse is called Völund. And this is a very ancient story. It's well known in Anglo-Saxon England. It's well known in several other cultures, but I'm particularly focusing on the stories in the Elder Edda, the Poetic Edda. The story about Völund. It's really very exciting. Now, when I was planning to go to Scandinavia initially for my research tour, one of the first things I wanted to see is a particular artefact that's considered to be a brooch, but it might be something else. But when I first saw it, maybe a year ago, I was absolutely blown out. And essentially, it's a man in a flying suit, and it has rockets on the bottom of it. He has flying boots on. When I read that it was considered to be Völund, I couldn't believe my luck. So when I went to Scandinavia, I initially flew to Zealand, as I proclaim at the end of that little flying sequence, and that's the main island of Denmark, where Copenhagen is. And from Zealand, I went first and saw the ship museum and the actual ship recreating workshops in Roskilde. And I met some of the guys that make the ships down there. And after a lovely day doing that, I excitedly headed off to Sweden. This is the bridge to Sweden. Denmark proceeding over there, and many a Viking ship has been in these waters. I can assure you of that. The long bridge. There's Svenska coming up behind me. Oh yeah. They're in the tunnel. So taking the train, I went across a long bridge that connects Denmark and Sweden. When I got to the other side, I changed trains and I headed off to the nearest station, which was called Lund, to where I could find this artefact. And what I was heading for was a place called Uppakra. Uppakra is one of those names that almost nobody outside of Sweden knows, but it was particularly a great religious centre, a place of great spiritual significance. This particular artefact that I'd found I thought would be kept there in Uppakra itself. So after a series of adventures, including getting thoroughly lost and meeting these couple of lovely young guys who helped me out heaps, when I arrived, I was very, very excited. And when I went in and talked to the people in there, the first thing I thought was, this place looks a bit small to contain really precious artefacts. It just didn't have that sort of security. And I found out that this artefact had actually gone back to Lund, where I'd just been, the train station, before all this couple of hours of adventure trying to get out to Uppakra. So I determined I'd better go there, but first I had a look around in Uppakra, and just outside the building was this wonderful reconstruction of a Viking Age Hof, a temple that they'd found in the excavation not too far from where they'd built this reconstruction. And I walked around inside there, checking it out. The reconstruction's based on their best guesses, based on the shape of some of the incredibly preserved churches in Norway particularly, that were once heathen temples. And you'll see on the screen now two different possible versions of this temple. And outside it, there's a statue of Odin with an unusual, looks like a horned helmet. Now, I'm going to make a video about this later because it's a particularly fascinating concept. But what I believe that helmet actually represents his two ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory. I think they're more than ravens. I think there's something very special about those helmets. Anyway, I hopped in a cab. I met another Swedish lady who was super keen on this whole thing. I told her about my paleocontact theories, and she was actually an archaeology student, I'm pretty sure. And she was remarkably open to my ideas, which was nice. So we travelled off, got to the University Library of Lund, which houses the museum. Really old, beautiful big building. And Lund itself is a lovely old town, and it turns out that Lund also is a very significant ancient Swedish town. It was once one of the capitals of Sweden in the Viking Age. So we went in, and the first thing I did was make a beeline to where I could see this Völund Broach. And I wasn't disappointed at all. I'm just here in the museum in Lund. I've just seen that fabulous flying Völund figure that I think is actually Viking Age high-tech, or probably way before the Viking Age. Might have been around about the time of Christ, or could have been even earlier, but it's from the Viking Age stories that we know about it. And this museum is full of the most incredible stuff. Just keeping my voice down so I don't spoil the mood. Wow. It's a Viking Age lady, brooches. We'll return to that incredible object soon, but first I want to tell you the story of Völund the elf. It's something special. Now, it comes from this book, and I'll be referring to this book. This is Saemunda Edda, often nowadays known as the Poetic Edda. So this is a story called Völund the Smith. In English we'd say the Lay of Völundr. There was a king called Nithuthr in Sweden. He had 2 sons and a daughter. She was called Bothvildr. There were 3 brothers, sons of the king of the Finns. One was called Slagfithr, the second Egil, the third Völundr. They skied and hunted wild beasts. They came to Ulfdalir and built themselves a house there. There is a lake there called Ulfsjar. Early one morning they found 3 young women on the lake's shore, and they were spinning linen. Their swan skins were besides them. They were Valkyries. There were 2 daughters of King Hlothfjer, Hlathguthr Svankvit and Hervor Alvitr. The third was Olrun, daughter of Kjar from Valand. They brought them back to the house with them. Egil married Olrun, and Slagfithr Svankvit, and Völundr Alvitr. They lived there for 7 years. Then they flew off to seek battles and did not come back. Then Egil skied in search of Olrun, and Slagfithr searched for Svankvit. But Völundr stayed in Ulfdalir. He was the most skillful man that people know of in old stories. King Nithuthr had him seized, as is told about here. So next comes a poem, and these poems are considered to be by scholars the most believable and accurate ancient stories because of their being poetry set in the old meters. It's known the proper way to write these meters, and there's a lot of them, and it's a specialized subject, but scholars are able to tell that these are from the real Viking Age, and so these stories are very precious. So this is how the poem has been translated. Maidens flew from the south across Myrkvithr, which is often translated as Mirkwood, which we know from Lord of the Rings. Young alien beings, to fulfill their fates. On a lake shore they settled to rest themselves. The southern ladies spun precious linen. One of them, a fair maid of men, enfolded Egil in her bright embrace. The second was Svankvit. She trailed swan feathers. And the third, their sister, enfolded Völundr's white neck. They stayed like that then for 7 years, but all the 8th they yearned, and in the 9th need parted them. The maidens were impelled to the murky wood. That's back to Mirkwood. Young alien beings to fulfill their fates. The weather-eyed shooter came there from the chase. Slagfithr and Egil found the halls empty. They went out and in and looked about them. Egil skied east after Olrun, and Slagfithr south after Svanvit. But Völundr stayed alone in Ulfdalir. He beat red gold about a firmly set gem. He closed all the snake arm rings well. Thus he waited for his radiant wife in case she came to him. So there's a lot to unpack in that. But of particular interest is that word Alvitr, Alvitr Unger, means young alien beings. And this is often translated just as young maidens. But in this translation, the translator insists that alien beings is the right translation. And in that first introduction, it actually says that the girl that Völundr married was the alien being. It refers to these girls as radiant. It calls them Valkyries, and most people know that concept now from the Marvel movies and from their study of the Norse myths. But generally, Valkyries aren't, well, they don't fly in swans. They ride sort of flying horses, and they choose the slain from battles to go to Valhalla, to join the Einherjar of Odin. That is the army that he's gathering towards the great final battle of Ragnarok. But what's super interesting here and relevant to our brooch that we've been looking at, found in Uppakra and stored and displayed in the University Museum of Lund, is that the word for the young lady's swan skins, as most translators put it, is actually a word that we'll encounter in the next few videos talking about the sky people, in that the word is, in the Norse it says, fundu þeir á vastrondu konur þrjár og spunnu lin. Það varu hjá þeim altahamir þeirra. Það varu valkyrjur. So this word altahamir literally means swan shape. Now, most translators will say swan feather cloak. It has the sense of a skin or something that a snake puts off, like a slough, I think the word is. But another clear meaning of that ending hamir is shape, just straight out a shape. So in those further videos I'm going to make, we'll be talking about Orenhamir, eagle shape, and also referring to a story concerning a special shape that Freya had, which Loki begs her to borrow after he's got himself in deep doo-doo, and the gods are getting old because they've lost Ithun, who was the lady who provided the therapy to keep the gods constantly young, and they all started to get really old, and a giant had taken her. And anyway, that'll be a whole video about that. But it's usually translated as feather cloak, or a hawk's feather cloak, but the words are actually varshams or varshamin, the feather, the hawk's shape, the hawk shape. It doesn't say feather at all. Feather is inferred by people who are just thinking of these stories as mythical, magical people transforming into creatures, but when you read the stories you realise that they're actually getting into these things and flying. Of course, this is what our Völund does. We'll get to that, but so you got the Arnaham or Ornhammer, and you got the Valsham or Valshamin. Norse, like modern Icelandic, is got the most incredibly complex grammar, so even though I'm really into it, I'm still learning. It's complex, but that's what these words mean, and that's my approach, is to retranslate and look for possible meanings outside of what people have ever thought about before, because as soon as you start to think about the possibilities of paleocontact and flying people, and not necessarily aliens, but high-tech people in the past, you start to think, wait a minute, this sounds like that. So the next thing that happens in this saga is this king, Nithuthr, lord of Njarar. He learned that Völundr stayed home alone, and being a nasty piece of work, he thought, well, maybe we can get there and catch him. And he knew it was reputed that Völundr and the brothers had great riches and that they were incredible smiths. and word of their skills had travelled all over the countryside. So he set out, went to Ulfsdalir, and took heaps of men in mail coats shining in the moon, and they went in, and they saw a whole lot of beautiful gold rings hanging on a rope. There were several hundred of the rings. They took them off and they put them back on, except for one which they left off, and it must have been the most beautiful one, and I guess they took it with them. So Völund comes home from the chase. He's out hunting bears by the sounds of it, and he starts up a fire. He starts roasting some nice crispy brown she-bear, and he's quite a hunter to hunt bears. He starts counting the rings, and he notices that the one that he made for Hlotfjer's daughter, his girl, the young alien being, as it says, the young alien being, that she had come back. He sat so long that he fell asleep. He must have been excited, thinking that she might have been just out doing something in the woods and she was going to appear, and she must have been exquisitely gorgeous. And I like to think these young alien beings were Aesir. They're called Valkyries, but these terms are vague for us because we have them from an ancient time where so much was lost. It was purged, it was suppressed, it was destroyed. The people who knew these things were destroyed by the terrible authoritarian early Roman Church, which was really just the Roman Empire in a different guise. Standover merchants, they got rid of all the understandings we have, but the fact that they're called young alien beings tells me, and they're radiant, and that they've flown there in these swan-shaped craft, I believe that they were from the Aesir. And he sat there so long that he fell asleep, and he awoke robbed of his will, which is interesting because it almost infers that he was drugged somehow. He felt heavy constraints on his hands and a fetter fastened on his feet. He says, "Who are the princes, they who have put a restrictive bast rope on me and bound me?" Now Neither, the lord of the Njarar, called out, "Where, Völund, wise one of the elves, did you get our wealth in Ulfdalir? There wasn't gold on Grani's path. I thought our land far from the mountains of the Rhin. I remember we had more treasures when we were a whole family at home." So basically this king is inferring that Völund is an elf, telling us that he's an elf, and calling him the wise one of the elves, and he's also inferring that he's a thief, that he's taken this gold and made things from the wealth that the king rightfully owns. So what he's about to do, you'll find out, but he's trying to make himself look like the good guy in the plot. Now, extremely interesting thing is that recently I've been reading this wonderful book by Professor Ármann Jakobsson, who's the professor of early medieval literature at the University of Iceland, which is called Háskóli Ísland, and who I met in Reykjavik and had a wonderful conversation with. He wrote this book, which is one of my favourite books of all time, The Troll Inside You, and it's about paranormal activity in the medieval North. But he's such a unique thinker and a world-renowned expert. So he's talking about the meanings of these words as they've come to us through sort of 16th, 17th century folk tales and fairy stories, through, the Lord of the Rings. That's where we get most of our ideas about elves from. Earlier generations knew of elves from other literature. We tend to think of an elf as a species different from man, so different from us. And in one of the first chapters, called Unreal Fauna, he says that it becomes more logical to interpret the evidence in such a way that the Old Norse alfr is a more unspecified term with a fairly broad significance, perhaps indicating any cultic paranormal being on a lower rung than the actual Aesir the high gods of Old Norse myth and legend, and then thus including the fertility gods term Vanir, but also apparently covering a variety of other beings. Thus, the Old Norse Alfr is used to indicate not only a specific race or species, or even category of elves, but rather any kind of paranormal figure clearly superior to humans. Somewhat similar to the way a modern anthropologist might use the word God or deity to mean a lowercase g God rather than uppercase God. If we regard the term so broadly significant, then it comes as no surprise that elves in the sagas sometimes seem to be minor deities or cultic figures, and perhaps are only rarely a distinct race or species, and neither would it come as a surprise that an elf could also be a human, a dwarf, or a troll. So I wrote to Professor Jakobsson, who has very kindly been a friend to me for the last 2 years, I think, and we've written back and forth about all sorts of subjects. But I wrote to him because I had been browsing, as I do, thinking about all sorts of Old Norse things, and I just had this sort of a brainwave, you might say, where I was thinking with my English mind, thinking Ulf, which in Norse is spelt A with a, I guess it's called a grav, going that way. LF, Ulf. We say the A like owl. Ulf, which you can see where our elf comes from. And I thought that sounds like half, you know, it looks like half, Ulf, half a mo, using the old Cockney. And so I looked it up, and looking in this rather ragged old edition of Zoega, Old Norse Dictionary, Old Icelandic Dictionary, first thing I see is that alpha, A with a grav LFA, is equal to halfa, H A with a grav LFA. Alpha equals halfa. So then I looked up halfa, and it has a whole list of things that could be halfa, like halfa risi, which means a half giant. So I wrote to him and said, what do you think? You know, could the word Ulf actually mean half human, half Aesir, half the Norse gods who came from Anatolia up into Scandinavia and took over? And I consider this happened back in the Bronze Age. Odin and Thor and Freya and all those gods. So he wrote back a very knowing, academic but open-minded response and said, well, etymologically that doesn't really match. However, I don't see a reason why people in the medieval period wouldn't have made that connection between Ulf and half, you know, Ulf and half. And he basically said, you know, that could have legs. It could be a point to that idea, which to me explains a lot, because these beautiful maidens who are called alien beings seem to me, they got flying craft, they're radiantly beautiful, they sound like, you know, children of the Aesir. And so they've come for a reason to see these three guys. They're sons of the king of Finland, and in the stories, the north of the world, the far north, up in Finland where the Sami live, was considered sort of magical. And in Heimskringla it talks about how there's all these elves and people living up there, and we get references to them from time to time. But it seems to me that these girls specifically came for these three young men who were half Aesir. And in a funny way, they're a lot like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who also were crossbreeds between gods and men. And they stayed with the boys for 9 years. And this is where the plot thickens, because if these girls are flying swan-shaped craft, craft that are called swan shapes, but they're actually jets, or I think they were jets, actually. I think, without giving too much away, I think there was the sort of technology we see with UFOs, but also I think these ancient high-tech people were using air-breathing craft for some reason. That's another subject, but I do think that these girls were probably experts in the technology, and in 9 years, these Alfs, these young men who are half Aesir, half human, were already very skillful, so I think they taught them, which leads on to what happens next. So, without going to every detail of it, and I'll put links below to as much as I can point you to read this. Some great resources online if you want to read the whole story. It's not terribly long. But Völund is grabbed. The queen comes in. Nithothr's queen comes in. He sees that they've not only got his ring, but they've also got this special sword, and he's cranky. He's angry about it. And the queen says, "Oh, look at him. His eyes glitter like a snake," which also is another clue to me that he wasn't quite normal human. Maybe he had glittering green eyes like that girl I met back in 1978, who might or might not have been from not of this world. If you watch my videos, listen to some of my podcast interviews where people have asked me about all this sort of stuff. But she notices that he's not just an ordinary guy. He's obviously dangerous. He hunts bears on skis with his brothers. So they have him hamstrung, which is a terrible, terrible, torturous thing to do to somebody, to cut the big sinews behind the knees that connect to the hamstring muscle, connects down to the tibia. So he's crippled for life, and the pain is apparently shocking, and it lasts for a long, long time. So they've made themselves a real enemy, but like all fools in these stories, they think, well, we just want the tech. We just want the skills of this guy. So they cart him back to where their kingdom is. They put him on an island. They say, basically, you will make stuff for us. And however they got that done, they might have had to threaten him with more punishment, or not feeding him, or whatever. Or maybe he was really smart, which I think he was, and said, look, okay, I'll just go along with it, pretended that he was docile, pretended that he was cowed by their cruelty, and he got his revenge. So the king and the queen's young sons, being young boys, it doesn't say how old, but they sound like they're probably 12. They've been told not to go there because they do what they're told not to do. He tricks them, kills them, makes jewellery out of their skulls, uses their eyeballs to make jewellery. It's an old tale. And he also gets a whole lot of their blood and puts it in some bags, and I'll tell you about that in a second. And then the beautiful young daughter comes over, and she's also besotted with him. He's undoubtedly very beautiful, handsome elf guy. She's easily seduced. Stories say that he raped her, but I just don't really get that sense. I think they got drunk together, and then she went along willingly, and next thing she's pregnant, and she sort of sticks up for him till the end. And another version of this story, which is called Thithrek's Saga, which has more information about what happened, has a bit more of a happy ending where Völund and the young beautiful daughter live forever, live on happily ever after sort of thing. Anyway, one thing leads to another, and Völund gets this flying machine together, and it doesn't really go into detail, but it just says, "I'd be well," said Völund, "were I to get on my webbed feet those which Nithothr's men took from me." Laughing, Völund raised himself aloft. Weeping, Bothvilder, the beautiful daughter of the king, went from the island, grieved for her lover's going and her father's wrath. And then he doesn't say how he flew, what he flew in. It just says that laughing, Völund raised himself aloft. So, people didn't raise themselves aloft up until the first balloon flights. So here's this very ancient story telling us, oh, he just laughed and raised himself aloft. He then flies over to where the king lives, and it says, Nithuthr's cunning wife, who's a bit of a piece of work, walks the whole length of the hall, but he, Völund, had settled in the hall yard to rest. Are you awake, Nithuthr, lord of Njarar? So he's landed in the yard. He's pretty cheeky. All the king's men are all there. One supposes it's late and maybe they're a bit drunk, but he's in his flying machine. And it says, the king says, I'm always awake, robbed of will. I sleep scarcely at all since the deaths of my sons. My head is chilled, your counsels are cold to me. I wish now for this, that I may speak with Völund. Tell me this, Völund, wise one of the elves, what happened to my healthy cubs? So the king realises they're gone, and he realises it must have been Völund that did it. But he doesn't know what happened. So Völund goes into detail about what he did to the kids, which I won't repeat, and he indicates that the king better not kill his own daughter just because she's pregnant. So that comes as a shock. And then Völund says, go to the smithy, the one that you made. There you'll find a bellows spattered with blood. I cut off the heads of your cubs and laid their legs under the fen of the fetter, which is the forge where they make the fetters that have held him. The king says, you couldn't utter words that would grieve me more, and I would not deny you, Völund, worse. No man is so tall that he may take you from a horse, nor so strong that he may shoot you from below, there where you hover up near the clouds. And then once again it says, laughing, Völund raised himself aloft, but unhappy Nithuthr sat behind then. It's a little bit out of order, which often happens in these ancient poems, but he's obviously taken off again, and the king said, I wish I could reach you, but you're hovering up there near the clouds. So he's up 500,000 feet at least. And in the other story, Thithrek's saga, it says that Völund's brother Egil, who you'd probably remember me telling you about, he was an incredible archer, and he's basically like the early William Tell. And he has to shoot an apple off his son's head at the order of a king. But in this other story, Thithrek's saga, it says that the king said to him, shoot your brother Völund up there in the sky on that flying machine, otherwise I'm going to kill you. But Völund, being a smart cookie, had got a bag of blood from the boys he'd killed and put it under his left arm, and he said to his brother Egil, got a message to him saying, shoot for under my arm, so that the blood pours out and the king will be like, oh, good one, you got him. So that's what happens. And we'll see this when we look again at the artifact very soon. So that's pretty much it. Völund gets away, and in the other saga, a bit more happens. Thithrek's saga. Maybe I'll visit this story in a bit more depth. You can tell, I hope you're still listening. It's quite a story. But what excites me and causes me not to be bored with this is that this is such a realistic story of flying. It's so, just even him up in the clouds, he must have had a loudspeaker, the way he just lifts aloft and the way he hovers. These are things that birds do, but it's at least a work of tremendous imagination. But when we get into looking closely at this artifact now, I really hope it'll blow your mind, because this artifact it's made in around about 1000 AD, so it's based on a story that's probably from 2000 years earlier. It's such an incredible story. It's been preserved for all that time. Let's have a look at this exciting piece of ancient art. This is an artwork with a purpose. This is to tell us a story of an incredible wonder that's been passed down probably for a couple of thousand years, person to person, within the group, And the most incredible thing about this is been artistically preserved. There is so much in this that could not be just imagined, I don't think, unless somebody had actually witnessed a flying suit with jets, with air intakes, with a helmet, all sorts of things. So let's just go in and see, firstly, some of the main qualities I instantly saw. The first thing I saw was these flames, okay? These flames. Now, just to outline them in case you can't see them. Okay, so they are flames. They're not feathers. They don't look like anything on this Völund object that's relating to feathers. What are they? They're flames, for sure. And I got a negative reaction from a lovely young lady at Uppakra when I asked her about this, the lady in the shop. She straight away said, oh, no, they're not flames. And I left it at that because I thought, well, people have been at you about this because it's sort of obvious. This object was only found about 2 years ago. So it's very new in the Viking world, the world of people who know stuff about Vikings. Obviously, this doesn't fit the narrative at all, namely, not just being a flying suit, but having flames. That says something, that says a knowledge of thrust. So we've got a few different things with aircraft that make an aircraft. The first is lift and weight. So these are 4 vectors. You've got a vector going downward, which is weight, the weight of the craft and the weight of the load. You've got a vector going upwards, which is lift, provided by the lifting surfaces, usually of the wing. The helicopters, they have a great big rotor spinning. Pure rockets, lift and thrust are the same thing, but with this is a craft that functions like a pretty normal aircraft. So the other 2 vectors are thrust and drag. So thrust goes this way, the aircraft away, and drag comes back this way, and it comes from the wind, comes from the air, the thickness of the air. And when you're traveling at speeds, which are fairly low, the air is very thick, and anyone who's ridden a motorbike knows what I'm talking about. You get a tremendous resistance. So creating this flame, I see this area here as the motor and the fuel. This could be the fuel cell here. And this down here, I see as some kind of artificial control. Both of these segments could be that, I imagine something with little thrusters like they have on spacecraft, just to help attitude control. All right, so what do we have here on the wings? Well, we've got a vortex. We've got a swirling vortex coming around and round into here. So what's that about? Well, the artist could have easily just done concentric circles just for, artistic evenness, but has chosen to do a vortex shape. Now, what I see as somebody with a bit of an aviation background, having been an officer in the Air Force Cadets back in the Vietnam War days, I'm not saying I'm a real pilot, but I had enough training and I used to teach this sort of stuff. I know the essential basics. So this to me straight away is indicating the air intake of a jet. And this lump here, after, many, many centuries in the ground, it's been quite corroded, but perhaps it even was pointy originally, but that looks nothing less than the cone that you see on the front of a propeller, or that you see on a turbojet where the air is being sucked in and you have this cone shape that helps the aerodynamic flow. So what I imagine is that the air gets sucked in here, goes through this system in some way and comes out here. Right, so that's a pretty smart system. There's lots of aircraft like this. They have the air intakes wide and then the thrust nozzles narrow at the back. Next thing, we've got ailerons. So see this little line here? That to me indicates ailerons. This line's obscured because there's something else that I'm going to talk about. But on an aircraft, the ailerons, these shapes here, when you want to bank the aircraft, which is turn, one goes up, one goes down. So this one comes up, this one goes down, the aircraft banks to the right, and vice versa. Now going to that thing I mentioned, can you see droplets here? Like that sort of shape? Number of droplets. Now this harks back to the story in Thithrek's saga, which is the other version of Völund. It's similarly ancient, but it talks about Völund hiding a bag of blood under his left arm, and his archer brother is forced to shoot Völund down while he's sort of still hittable by the king, Nithuthr, and Völund's brother shoots the bag of blood, and that shows the blood dripping down. So this is the thing that confirmed to archaeologists and historians, oh, this is a representation of Völund, and that's Völund the Kvíðr, and also Thithrek's saga. Next thing, this is aerodynamic. So you can see its front view, it's very sort of chiseled. You've got pointy shapes like this, very much like the cabin of a fighter. And you've got a top. Obviously it represents a man, but you know, these could be goggles. It's pretty rough. They could be goggles, or they could be representative of the windows on a cockpit. In this case, it's man size, it's probably goggles. If we come over here, this is the best side view I could get in the museum because it was in a big glass cabinet. You can really see the aerodynamic quality of this helmet. It's basically a very classic fighter jet, you know, especially a big one like the F-111. A fighter jet nose, and birds have the same thing. It's just so they can flow through the air at speed. Fishes have the same thing. They're hydrodynamic. This is aerodynamics, and it flows right back there. Okay, so the tail, this is the elevator. Okay, this is on aircraft. You have an elevator on the tail. It goes up or down, makes the aircraft either climb or dive. Control surfaces, these are called. Looking more closely at the Völund figure, we see a very unusual suit. It's not like any suit of armour I've ever seen. It's certainly not like a Viking Age, war clothes suit, which are usually like plates of steel in leather or just pure leather or chain mail. These are lots and lots of concentric rings, and it really looks actually like a spacesuit. This is the only thing I can think of. When I first saw it, I thought that's a spacesuit. That's a sealed suit that's made to control high speed, protect from the change of atmosphere as you get higher and higher, to keep the person in there warm. It's very solid. He's got very solid boots. And the interesting thing about these boots is they're very uncommon, if not impossible, in the ages before the Viking Age, because they've actually got a heel. This is a heel here. Now, people didn't have boots with heels back then. I mean, it could have happened, but we've never really found any boots with heels. They're usually soft leather. They might have some metal tacks on the bottom, but this is a much more modern looking boot. I mean, it could be from the Renaissance. It looks like a space boot, a flying boot, and the whole suit gives the impression of being sealed. You've got strong knees, it comes up to the knee. And even if Völund wasn't hamstrung and crippled, he'd still need to have his legs like that because of these jets. This roaring, flaming, red-hot, supersonic wind, that's what a jet is, thrusting him, would just, burn his legs off. So he's got his legs the way you would have. Like I think I mentioned, I think of these as little thrusters perhaps embedded in there, maybe the fuel tank there, and his helmet on the top. So this whole structure here really looks like it's been designed by an engineer. It just has the feeling of some kind of very high-tech. You can imagine it being made out of special substances, not just steel, but the sort of things we have in our modern super light, super strong structures that engineers are always developing. So that looks very high tech. Finally, if I go over here, you'll see my very enthusiastic quick sketch that I made when I first saw this. It was over a year ago. I can't remember exactly when, but I saw this little picture and I thought, my God, that is the most convincing ancient flying representation I have ever seen. So I drew this up, just a quick sketch of how I imagined Völund flying in the suit with his jets blasting, the air intakes, sucking the air in there. He's got a neuro control helmet connected to his brain so he doesn't have to flap his arms, obviously, and he doesn't have to really manually control the wings necessarily. Maybe there's actuators in there doing that. And that's it. And you could really do a lot with this. And I'm even thinking, it might be cool at some stage to make a model of this and fly it. Anyway, thanks so much for listening. I hope you've really enjoyed this episode. I've enjoyed making it. Looking forward to seeing you for the next episode. There's heaps more ancient flying. I think it's going to blow you out. There's a lot of similarities to this. This is the jewel in the crown. That's why I wanted to share it with you first off. It's one of the driving forces that took me to Scandinavia, because when I saw this, I went, I've got to get over there, got to see this for myself. And there's all these other supposed bird shapes that are going to be in the next video, which I also thought, I've really got to go and have a look at this stuff. And that's it. So look forward to seeing you next time. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Tell your friends about my channel. Follow me on Facebook. Follow me on Instagram, Viking Superpowers. And have a great time. See you later. Bye.